Hi, my name is Eve Campbell. I'm an archaeologist based with Archaeological Management Solutions, and I'm really delighted to be here talking to you as part of Heritage Week 2024. So, the topic of my talk today is later medieval Gaelic settlement in Machaire Connacht, insights from the N5 Road Project. What I'm going to be talking to you about today are some of the excavations that our company, AMS, carried out as part of the pre-construction phase archaeological works on the Ballaghaderreen to Scramoge Road Project. And in particular, what I'm going to be talking about are those sites that date to the later medieval period. So we're roughly talking about between the 12th and the 17th centuries, or broadly between the coming of the Anglo-Normans and the plantation period. I'm going to be talking in particular about what those sites can tell us about life in medieval Gaelic Ireland, because the area of North Roscommon we're dealing with was very much part of the Gaelic lordships, and sort of drawing out the broader significance that these sites have for understanding Gaelic settlement in Machaire Connacht, but also as a whole. So before I launch into the archaeological details, I'm going to start with a little story from the annals. So in 1554, the Annals of Lochee recorded a skirmish between the Ó Flannagáin and MacDermott lordships of North County Roscommon. Ó Flannagáin and his kindred made a raid on Brian, son of the MacDermott, but failing to take any cattle, they made off instead with some of Brian's dishes and a gaming board. The attack did not go unanswered, and Brian and a small party of raiders reportedly followed the dishes and the gaming board, taking 12 score cattle, so about 250 cattle, in retaliation. To the archaeological eye, this is a really intriguing entry, drawing us into the material world of the later medieval Gaelic lordships of North Connacht. And it's to that world, and in particular the aforementioned Ó Flannagáin lordship, that I want to bring us today. As scholars of medieval Gaelic Ireland have pointed out, the large infrastructural projects that have added so much to our archaeological knowledge across, in particularly the last couple of decades, have by and large tended to be located in the south and eastern part of Ireland. And this is very much in the Anglo-Norman controlled territories and outside the land controlled by Gaelic lords, whose land was largely in the west and the north, so in Ulster, Connacht and parts of Munster by and large. And the N5 Ballaghaderreen Road Project offers a corrective to this trend. Starting close to Strokestown before heading west towards Ballaghaderreen, the road cuts through the north of the O'Connor lordship of Machaire Connacht and through the small sub-lordship of the O'Flannagáins. And this is an area that remained well and truly under Gaelic control into the early modern period. On this slide, we have some maps of the medieval lordships. So on the left of the slide, we can see a famous map by a historian called Kenneth Nichols, and it's a map of the medieval lordships of Ireland. And on the right, we can see an extract kind of based on this map showing the O'Connor lordship of Machaire Connacht and the smaller sub-lordship of the O'Flannagáins. And so the larger area is the O'Connor lordship, and then this little small pocket up here is the lordship of the O'Flannagáins. Many of you will be familiar with the O'Connor lordship. The Sept were one of the preeminent dynasties of 12th and 13th century Ireland, although by the later period the lordship had fractured into the O'Connor Row and the O'Connor Dun and had declined somewhat in power and status more generally. The O'Flannagáins were kinsmen of the O'Connor. They were also part of the Síl Murthy, and they served as their stewards or bailiffs. The word in the documents is Ard Muir, as well as holding multiple ecclesiastical roles, including at one point one of them was a bishop of Elphin. And we see them in the annals, engaged in various raids and skirmishes, rising out with their O'Connor overlords. Their small lordship was variously known as Clann Cathail, and then in the later period as Machaire Flannagáin. And it was located between Tulsk and Elphin, and their caput was at a place called Ballyuchter, at the site of a now demolished castle, which was probably a tower house, and nothing of that remains today. Excavations on the N5 have uncovered significant later medieval remains, so encompassing things like raths or ring forts with evidence for late occupation, burials, unenclosed non-elite houses, agricultural features, killings, the environs of a medieval parish church, as well as more sporadic sites like isolated hearths. This is a map of the later medieval sites found on the scheme, overlaid on a map of the Ó Flannagáin lordship. And you can see that with the exception of one site down here near Strokestown, which was an O'Connor site, the bulk of the sites are located within the Ó Flannagáin lordship, which is the rough extent of which is marked in red here. And there's a particular concentration of sites around Ballaghaderreen, which is just here on the Owen River, and a lot of the sites are kind of in quite close proximity to Ballaghaderreen. And noting also Elphin, which is a really important diocesan capital, and the medieval parish church of Shankill. So this is like a nice little cluster of later medieval settlement in the area. So I'm going to talk about two main aspects of the later medieval evidence today. I'm going to talk about evidence for later medieval occupation of ring forts, and in particular, I'm going to talk about these two sites, Lurgan 3 and Killeen East 2. And I'm also going to talk about non-elite, sort of unenclosed, I suppose peasant housing might be a way to describe it. So later medieval everyday housing. And we have 5 sites on the scheme which show evidence for this type of archaeological material. And just on the side of the screen here, we have an early modern 16th to early 17th century map of the area, and you can just see Ballaghaderreen marked here, so showing its significance in the contemporary landscape. So the two raths that I'm going to talk to you about, Killeen East 2 and Lurgan 3, are located on a glacial ridge alongside the Owen River, which we can kind of see here. And they're both, as I mentioned, within a kilometre of Ballaghaderreen. So in the later medieval territorial matrix then, the sites can probably be understood as associated with Ballaghaderreen, with the Ó Flannagáin capital. So they probably had some kind of role relating back to that. Both sites have, as you would expect for a ring fort, early medieval origins. So Killeen East 2 appears to have been originally built in the 8th century, while Lurgan seems to be like a small bit earlier, so 7th to 8th century. And evidence shows that Lurgan was occupied as late as the 14th century, while Killeen East 2 seems to have been occupied possibly as late as the 17th century. The character of activity at both raths undoubtedly changed, across their long occupation period. So it's definitely not the same thing happening across all those hundreds of years. And there may have been, for example, breaks in the occupation, but if there were, these are not visible in the archaeological record. So we can't see any clear breaks in activity at the sites. So I'm going to start by looking at Killeen East. So the site comprises a rath or a ring fort with a large annex enclosing 3 to 4 souterrains. And there's also evidence of a nice kind of entrance feature, perhaps a gate tower inside the interior. And we see just kind of scattered through the interior, largely of the rath, a series of pits and post holes. Most of them are undated, but there's no clear evidence of specific buildings in the interior. So any evidence for those simply doesn't survive. While this rath was originally cut around the 8th century, it appears to have been, the ditch of the rath appears to have been recut, as indicated by 2 radiocarbon dates that were retrieved from the material within the ditch. So a cow bone from the base of the ditch near the entrance dated to the 15th to 17th centuries, and a cow bone from the middle layers of the ditch opposite the entrance dated to around the 14th century. A burnt pit, possibly the remains of a truncated cereal drying kiln, also dated to the 15th to 17th centuries. We also have a number of human burials from the site with later dates. So 2 children were found buried in one of the disused souterrains, and a radiocarbon date in one of those returned a date of the 13th to 14th centuries. And an older woman who was buried aligned north-south in a grave in the middle of the rath returned a radiocarbon date of between the 15th and the 17th centuries. So we've got really good radiocarbon dating here for late occupation at the site. So in addition to the radiocarbon dates, we also have evidence of late occupation in the form of finds. And this is because many archaeological finds can be dated based on their form and what we call typology. So you can think about your Nokia 3210s really dates it would date to a very specific period in time. And it's the same with certain kind of artifacts. So some of the objects here are really clearly datable. So first I'm going to talk about this beautiful pin. It's a copper alloy club-headed pin, and this would have a broad date of between the 11th and 15th centuries. Knives were one of the most common finds from both of the ring forts. Now, some knives are not very clearly datable, or they have kind of a broad date range, but this example here is what's called a whittle-tanged knife for the bolster, and our metal specialist tells us that this dates to around the 16th century. Below this we have some other nice objects. We have a little copper alloy mount here, and some objects that are have very clear military connotations. This here is a small iron loop of chainmail, and we have beside it what's called a bodkin bladed arrowhead, so a medieval arrowhead. And down here in the corner of the slide, these 2 objects have been interpreted as chapes from a scabbard. So that's a protective metal element placed in the bottom of the scabbard to hold a sword. And finally, this little object here has been interpreted as possibly being a spur fitting. So that is a little fitting that's used to fasten a spur to the foot using a leather strap. And finally, we also have one piece of pottery of a type that's called, it's German stoneware, Westerwald stoneware, and this would date to probably the 17th century. So the artifacts are very much telling a similar story to the radiocarbon dates, telling us that we seem to have occupation or activity at the rath into the 17th century. So now I'm going to move on to talk about Lurgan, the site of Lurgan 3. Lurgan 3 consisted of a circular rath set within a much larger kind of shallow enclosure, and the site featured a souterrain and several cereal drying kilns and other agricultural features. There are a number of pits in the inside of the rath, but again we don't have any clear definitive evidence of structures, although they surely did exist, they just don't survive. So again at Lurgan we have some radiocarbon dating for later occupation of the rath. A sample of charcoal from the middle fill of the ditch dated to the 11th to 12th centuries, and a second charcoal sample from an adjacent sort of later agricultural feature dated to the 14th century. There was also, like at Killeen East, there were a number of burials from Lurgan, and some of these have late dates. So a young male who was found buried supine in an earlier ditch returned a 13th to 14th century date. And a very tightly crouched child was found buried in the one of the entrance terminuses of the ring fort, and this also dated to the 13th to 14th centuries. And here we see some of the later medieval finds from Lurgan 3. So they include, again, objects you'll note that seem to have kind of clear military connotations. So we have a fragment of a medieval horseshoe. We have, again, another iron bodkin bladed arrowhead. And then we have this lovely copper alloy mount, and the metal specialist suggested this might be connected to something from a horse's harness, for example, like a decorative element on a horse's harness. And then finally we have more chainmail, and this time it's copper alloy chainmail, so probably like a decorative element of chainmail, maybe from a collar or a hem on what would otherwise be an iron coated mail. So to sum up, both raths we had evidence for occupation well past the early medieval period, which would be the period traditionally associated with ring forts. At Lurgan, as late as the 14th century, while at Killeen perhaps into the 17th century. One commonality at both sites is the occurrence of military or horse-related artefacts. Now, there definitely are survival biases at play here, so these metal artefacts are more likely to survive in the ground than other types of materials. So we might think about like textiles or plant-based materials or wicker or all other types of material that were really vital for different aspects of life in medieval Ireland. But it also is a very clear pattern, and it raises certain questions or possibilities of the role that these raths played within the later medieval Ó Flannagáin lordship, and particularly as we noted in the context of their proximity to the caput or the centre of the lordship. The mail fragments, weapons and horse trappings might suggest that the raths had a role as residences of or in outfitting and supplying the aristocratic horsemen who formed a core component of later medieval Gaelic military forces. So this is what I'm suggesting. And here we see some contemporary depictions of elite Gaelic military figures, and we can see in these depictions some of examples of depictions of some of the finds we have from our site. So you'll note all of these figures are wearing coats of mail, which was very typical of Gaelic armour. They favoured light manoeuvrable chainmail over heavy plate armour. You can see the copper alloy element, as I said, is very likely to be from a decorative hem. So maybe from, as you can see this figure here, from Phelim O'Connor's tomb in Roscommon Abbey. You can see there's a lovely kind of hem piece here. You also, you'll note here on the depiction of the McMurrough chief here, he's wearing spurs on his bare feet. So we have a possible spur fitting. Many of the figures here have swords, and we can think about our sword shapes. And you'll notice here how the horses have lovely decorative horse reins and horse trappings. So some of our objects might be related to that. We know, for example, that in contemporary medieval Gaelic poetry, the figure of the male military figure is one very much where there's a very much emphasis on male beauty and aesthetics. And the poetry talks about the glimmering armour and the beautiful studs on some of the leather belts. So we can think about some of the objects in that context and about these aristocratic horsemen, of the Ó Flannagáin line, wanting to present themselves and look really glamorous to the best of their abilities. So I'm now going to move on to the second part of my talk to discuss non-elite Gaelic settlement. While the dwellings and the sites connected with the Gaelic aristocracy and the lordly sites have been pretty well studied, so places like tower houses and in places like Roscommon and moated sites, for example. The character of non-elite Gaelic settlements, the housing of everyday people, has proved largely elusive. And it seems that most ordinary Gaelic dwellings left little trace on the landscape, or indeed the archaeological record. And outside of several examples excavated in the Ulster uplands, largely carried out by scholars based in Queen's University, very few later medieval Gaelic houses have been excavated. So our understanding or our concepts of later medieval Gaelic housing and early modern Gaelic housing draws really heavily on the colonial archive. So of early modern maps and written accounts that were by and large produced as part of early modern colonisation in Ireland. So the plantations and the Cromwellian period and all those kind of that kind of period of Irish history. So here we have some lovely examples of early modern maps showing different types of Gaelic houses. And kind of based on these maps and other sources, scholars have argued that there are kind of two main types of buildings in later medieval Gaelic Ireland. So we have a very light kind of wattle construction known as a crate, which is sometimes described as sort of like a beehive or an upside down basket. And we can see examples of this on two maps. So this map from Carrickfergus and this map from the complete opposite side of the country down in Cork. So these little beehive-like or basket-like huts. And the second type is a more substantial type of house that appears to be framed with crooks. So crooks are basically a type of house construction where you have really long rafters that sit on the ground and reach all the way up to the top of the roof, and they carry the weight of the roof. So in a crook house, the walls are simply weatherproofing and the whole structure is carried on these long rafters or crooks. So you can see here on this map by Richard Bartlett, outside Dungannon, these little buildings, and these are generally interpreted as crooks, crook framing. So those are the two main types of buildings, and scholars like Kieran O'Connor have argued that both of these types of buildings were really suited to Gaelic society because they were quite movable and quite mobile, and we know that mobility is definitely a theme in Gaelic settlement, to be sure. So this is our map of the sites excavated on the N5, and just to recap, here are the sites where we found evidence of non-elite settlement in the form of buildings and pits and agricultural features. So oblong buildings were identified at a number of these sites, defined by shallow gullies and yielding dates between the 13th and 18th centuries. And these were found at Kilvoy, at Gortnacrana 1 and 5, and at Gortnacrana 7. And again, you'll note particularly the Gortnacranas are again very near to Ballaghaderreen, and Kilvoy is quite close to another known Ó Flannagáin site at what's known today as Mantua or Muntoch in the historical records. So interesting connections between settlement and primary residences within the landscape. And then at Killeen East 1 here, we have tentative evidence for a more slighter structure, possibly something like a crate. Okay, so let's go and have a look at what these buildings look like. So this is Kilvoy 1, the first site we're going to talk about. And as I mentioned, it's quite close to Mantua House, and this is noted in some of the historical records to have been one of the Ó Flannagáin seats during the medieval period. So we have three potential buildings from this site. As you can see, they're fairly spaced out. The buildings don't survive terribly well. They're defined by shallow curvilinear gullies that appear to enclose oblong areas. Structure A, which we see here, is one of the better preserved examples, and it's about 5.4 metres wide internally. And structure C, which we see here, is about 10 metres long internally. So that's kind of a rough estimation of the size of the buildings. We also have two pits or hearths associated with this settlement. And the fills of both the gullies and some of the pits have been analysed, and they were found to contain charred grain, charcoal, and heavily charred animal bone. And willow and hazel charcoal from one of the pits and from one of the structures both returned fairly close radiocarbon dates, dating to between the 13th and 15th centuries. So moving east from Kilvoy 1, we have a cluster of sites in Gortnacrana townland. Again, close to Ballaghaderreen, the Caput, and the sites are all located on a glacial ridge, a south-facing glacial ridge overlooking the Owenor River and one of its tributaries here. So quite a typical and lovely location for settlement in any period of time. Gortnacrana 1 and 5 are in the western part of the townland, and they're probably part of the same complex or settlement, just happen to be excavated as separate sites. So I'm going to move on now to talk about Gortnacrana 1 and 5. So at Gortnacrana 5, 4 oblong structures similar to Kilvoy were found, with a scatter of hearths and pits across both Gortnacrana 5 and Gortnacrana 1. So 2 of the buildings from Gortnacrana 5 give clear later medieval dates. Structure 1, which is by far the best preserved of any of the buildings, gave early 15th century dates, and structure 4 down here gave late 13th to 14th century dates. The poor state of the structures again means that it's difficult to give dimensions for them, but structure 1, which is again, as I mentioned, the best preserved, is 8.9 meters long internally and 6.6 meters wide internally. And you'll note here that it has breaks in the long walls, which appear to indicate opposing entrances, which would be something that we know from Irish vernacular traditions, and which is mentioned for some of the early modern houses in travel literature found in the Colonial Archive. The gullies defining the buildings were pretty shallow, so they're only up to about 20 centimetres deep, and they were found to contain charred grain, heavily burnt animal bone, and charcoal that was interpreted by the specialist as hearth dumps. We have a small assemblage of finds from the site, including a badly preserved iron knife and 2 lovely glass objects, one which is a glass bead and the second which is like a glass stud, which would have been attached possibly to clothing or some kind of other object. Gortnacrana 1 is probably, as I mentioned, part of the same complex as Gortnacrana 5. And at the site there was a scatter of pits and hearths containing charred grain and charcoal, and 2 of the pits, this pit here and this pit up here, both returned 13th to 14th century radiocarbon dates. So now moving on to Gortnacrana 7, site best known for its large Iron Age notched wooden idol, but it also contained a really fascinating, possibly more interesting to me, late medieval, early modern settlement. So the settlement is located very close to the edge of the fen, so it's again on this lovely south-facing slope overlooking what would have been marshy or wet ground in the period. At Gortnacrana 7, 2 15th to 18th century buildings were identified, one of which, structure D down here, a little bit blocked by my my picture there, contained appears to have been deliberately burnt down, and you can see the charred remains of this in this photograph here. So that's the gully defining this building, and we found lots of charred little bits of what looks like wattle perhaps in the gully. Structure D was 13.2 meters long and 5.6 to 6.6 meters wide internally, and returned 16th to 18th century radiocarbon dates. So I mean, it's probably from the earlier end of that radiocarbon date spectrum. I don't think this is a late 18th century building. I think it's probably more like a 16th or 17th century building. Only part of structure F survived, as you can see up here, and it survives as a part of a gully and an internal hearth and some pits. And we also have two other radiocarbon dates from the site also overlap this period. So we have a 16th to 17th century date from a structure down here, which we think might be a kiln. And we have a 15th to 17th century date from an L-plan ditch, also on the site. So the site has two buildings and some associated agricultural features. We have a small assemblage of finds from the site, and this includes a little spur, which is very small and is possibly belonging to a child, a medieval horseshoe, and an iron buckle, which is probably again horse gear. And then we have a rotary quern fragment as well, so which would have been used to grind grain for making bread and other dishes. Our final site is Killeen East 1, where a single pit contained charred grain, animal bone, charcoal, and a broken quernstone. So this is our little pit here. A barley grain from the pit returned to 15th to 17th century date. The contents of the pit suggest domestic waste of a small household, encompassing cooked food waste and probable hearth residues. And the pit might signal the presence of a small structure such as a crate that left no other archaeological remains. So, more broadly, how can we interpret all of these buildings that we've just talked about? Well, the first thing to say is that, like, in trying to think about what the buildings actually looked like or how they were built, the gullies that define that are the primary piece of evidence defining the buildings are probably they're probably not slot trenches or foundation trenches, but they're probably what's known as like a drip gully to drain water from around the buildings. And the evidence would suggest we're probably dealing with buildings that are supported by crook frames with little or no earth-fast elements. So there's no posts going down into the ground. Everything's kind of like above ground. Kieran O'Connor has argued that the Gaelic lords of North Roscommon were using crooks from at least 1300, maybe earlier, and this fits pretty well with the dating that we have from the sites that we've looked at. And as I mentioned before, in crook buildings, the walls serve largely as weatherproofing and all the weight is held on the crooks. And in this context, the walls of these buildings could have been made by wattle panels or earth. So those are two materials that we know are used in these kinds of buildings. And given the scale of the buildings, we could suggest that the walls were quite thick, maybe up to 1 metre thick, quite easily. A really excellent comparison for our buildings, and one which I think can help us to think about what they maybe looked like or were it was like to be in them, comes from this really cool, I think, reconstruction of a 17th century crook frame timber house from Glencoe in Scotland. And the building is really it's really comparable in size to the sites we have on the N5. And it's built with what I think would be probably quite similar materials. So you can see here, that's what the finished building looks like. These are the crooks that are holding up the roof, and you can see here during its construction, it's built using woven wattle panels and earth or sod for the walls. The tradition of building, so while crooks would have gone out of use in a lot of parts of Ireland in the early modern period, largely due to lack of access to timber. So timber is a really massive issue, lack of access to timber. The tradition of building in this kind of oblong form continues into the post-medieval period in Ireland, and we can see some examples of that, which I think probably, they're buildings that have the roots in the medieval period in some of the so-called beehive houses from Achill. So these were kind of oblong stone buildings that were documented on Achill in the 20th century. So we can see some of the roots of the building traditions from our sites on the N5 in places like Achill in the 20th century. By way of comparison for the slighter crates, I just wanted to show some examples of what they possibly might have looked like. So I have images here drawn from several archives. So on the two bottom images are from a project to document New Age traveller houses and different types of accommodation from them. So these are from the 1980s, and you can see here the kind of light timber frame, kind of woven frame, covered with textile, so probably canvas or tarp in this case. And we have a similar thing with traditional Irish traveller accommodation, and this is a traveller tent from 1960. This comes from the National Folklore Collection. And then I thought this was a really interesting building too. It's recorded as a shed from County Waterford, and it's again from the National Folklore Collection, and it's just it seems to be like a conical sort of structure with a single door, and the roof or the covering material is natural fibre, so it looks like it's maybe turf with maybe some scraws or a little bit of thatch in places. So I think any of these would be really useful jumping off points for thinking about what these crates or light buildings might have been like in the later medieval landscape. And it would be instructive just to think about like what archaeological trace any of these would leave, and I think it would probably be very slight and something that you wouldn't necessarily pick up archaeologically. So just to finish up, I just want to make a point about some of the archaeobotanical evidence from the N5 later medieval Gaelic sites. So when we think about Gaelic Ireland, the emphasis tends to always be on cattle rearing, and we might think about the 12 score cattle that were carried up by MacDermott from the Ó Flannagáin lordship in the 16th century. But it's important to note that arable farming was also, you know, an important part of the economy. Like, people had to eat, and they ate grain as a staple. And we can very much see that from the assemblages from our settlement sites, our house sites. And, you know, as would be expected, oat is very much the dominant crop, and it's a crop that grows pretty well in a damp climate, and it's really suited to particularly the western part of Ireland and areas with poorer soils. But free threshing wheat is also found after oat, and also we have barley. And in addition to these staple grain crops, we also have an array of other kind of wild and collected foods that have kind of culinary uses, but also like a whole range of ethnobotanical uses. So they can be used in different kind of industries, or for making different things, or for medicines, or different sort of things. So some examples I just want to mention are, you know, we have bedstraw, which was sometimes used as a rennet in dairy making, goosefoot, which can be eaten, linen or flax, which of course can be eaten or has, you know, used to make linen cloth, and hazelnuts, which are a great classic snack that everybody still loves to eat today. So finally, to finish up, I want to return to our stolen gaming board that I started the talk with. One of the most interesting finds from the site is from the medieval parish church of Shankill, which again is pretty near Ballaghaderreen. And here we found, in a later medieval context, a ceramic gaming piece, or gaming peg, if you will. So it is made out of fired pottery. And it has here at the bottom a little hole where you would insert a peg to be used with a pegged gaming board. And it is indeed with a gaming board, with a peg such as this may have indeed been used with a board such as was stolen by the Ó Flannagáins from their neighbours at the cost of 240 cattle back in 1554. So that is the end of my talk. I hope you enjoyed it and you learned something about life in medieval Gaelic Roscommon. So two things. First, just to acknowledge that projects such as the N5 are huge collaborative endeavours, and there are many, many people involved in making it all happen. And also to say that there is going to be a book forthcoming detailing all the archaeological sites that were found on the N5 Road Project. It will be produced by TII, Transport Infrastructure Ireland, and co-authored by myself and by my colleague Rossum Weldon. So keep your eyes open for it. Thanks very much.